Okay, so that question, is monogamy like actually natural? We got a ton of research on this one. Articles on like evolutionary biology, psychology, even some history in the mix.
Yeah, we've got a lot to unpack here. It's going to be interesting to look at this from all these different angles.
Feels like we're about to really challenge some deep assumptions about like love and relationships and what we think is normal, right?
And that's what's so great about a deep dive like this. It's not just about learning new stuff, but actually questioning what we think we already know. And a good place to start is that feeling a lot of people have. Like, is monogamy actually harder than everyone pretends it is?
Right. We hear about one true love and all that, but then reality kind of hits. Maybe you see someone else you're attracted to, or you start to wonder if maybe those fairy tale romances are just that fairy tales.
And one of the sources, a clinical psychologist actually talks about this directly. They say that the specific relationship model, whether it's monogamy, polyamory, whatever, it's actually less important than something else entirely honesty.
I thought that was interesting. Especially with that study we have showing that, like, even if you try really hard, monogamy is not exactly guaranteed. So is this psychologist saying it's more about having those awkward conversations about attraction and boundaries than about never ever being tempted?
That's a really good point. And yeah, basically the psychologist is saying the problem isn't necessarily feeling attracted to someone else. It's what you do with that attraction. It's about, can you act within the rules of your relationship, whatever those rules are?
Okay, so if you're monogamous, it's not like seeing someone attractive on the street. That's the issue. It's when you break those agreed upon rules that things go bad.
Exactly. Like they're saying it's normal to be attracted to other people. We're all human. But the problem is often that people don't talk about those attractions or those temptations or struggles. And that's what causes problems down the line.
It's like if you never talk about the elephant in the room, eventually it's going to sit on you and crush you.
Yeah.
But what about that research that showed that even when couples actively tried to make monogamy work, it often didn't? Where does that fit in?
That's where things get really interesting. This study found that even with all that effort, avoiding temptation, nurturing the main relationship, it didn't actually matter that much in terms of whether someone would end up cheating. And that really makes you think twice about this idea that monogamy is easy or natural for everyone.
So even if you're doing all the right things, being honest, like that psychologist said, it still might not be enough. Kind of a depressing thought.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if maybe we're aiming at the wrong thing altogether. And that's where that article on the evolution of all this comes in.
Now, this is where I think it gets really interesting. Did our caveman ancestors sit around debating the ethics of polyamory? I'm guessing not.
Haha, probably not. But this article suggested that monogamy, as we think of it now, might not be so much about deep biological urges, but more about something that came up later in human history, resource security.
Resource security. What does that even mean when we're talking about ancient relationships?
So think about it. Once humans started farming, there was this idea of owning land and passing it down to your kids. This article basically says that monogamy might have become a thing as a way to be sure who your kids were, to make those inheritance lines clear.
So it wasn't even really about love or just being a pair, but more like who gets the farm when you die. Not very romantic when you put it that way. It makes you wonder how differently we might see relationships if history went another way.
Right, and it makes you think about how that applies today. It used to be farmland. Now maybe it's how much money you make or your social status, or even just that feeling of security we want from a long-term partner.
That's a really interesting connection. Like we've inherited this relationship model that's maybe more about protecting stuff tangible or intangible than we realize.
Yeah.
And this gets even more complicated when you think about that partible paternity thing that the article talked about.
And that's such a great example of how much culture changes, how we see even something as basic as being a parent. In some indigenous cultures, particularly in South America, there's this whole practice where multiple men are involved in raising one child.
Wait, so there's like more than one dad? How does that even work?
See, we tend to think of biological fatherhood as the main thing. But in these cultures, a child might have multiple fathers, all officially recognized, who are all taking care of them and raising them.
Wow. So the idea of who dad is way more open and less about your genes. That really challenges our assumptions.
It really does. And this idea that there have always been different types of families throughout history leads perfectly into that Student's Journal article you sent about monogamy and how different cultures see it.
It's like you were saying before, how so much of what we think is normal is just what we learned growing up. And this article really gets into that. It shows how, monogamy is common, but it's definitely not the only way people have done things throughout history.
Exactly. And to show that the student found all these examples of famous people from history who had non-monogamous relationships. So it's not just a new thing.
Okay, so tell me about these historical figures. Who are we talking about?
Well, one example is Virginia Woolf, the writer. She had relationships with both men and women, which was pretty radical for her time.
And this wasn't like just cheating, right? The article said she had serious long-term relationships with women while she was married. How did people back then see that? Did they have this idea of ethical non-monogamy?
That's such a good question. And it shows how much our ideas about relationships have changed over time. It probably wasn't as accepted back then to be open about different kinds of relationships. But Woolf's life definitely makes you think twice about this idea that monogamy was the only way in the past.
Right? It's like we look back and think it was all so simple and romantic.
Yeah.
But really, people have always found ways to challenge the rules and do things differently. But let's switch gears for a second, talk about the brain stuff. We've talked about the psychology, the history, the culture. What about the actual biology of monogamy? Is there like a monogamy part of the brain?
I wish it were that easy. But there's some really cool research happening on how monogamous behavior works in the brain, especially in animals like prairie voles.
Oh yeah, those little guys are like the superstars of monogamy in the animal world. What's going on in their tiny brains that might tell us something about our own relationships?
So unlike other types of voles, prairie voles make these super strong pair bonds. They basically mate for life, which makes them perfect for study and attachment in the lab.
So they're like the ultimate test case for understanding how pair bonding works on a biological level.
Exactly. Researchers have been looking at a specific part of the brain called the social decision-making network. This part is all about how we read social cues, make choices about social interactions, and yeah, form those attachments.
Okay, so break that down for me. What's this network actually doing when we're talking about relationships?
Okay, imagine this. You walk into a party and see someone cute.
Yeah.
Your brain goes into overdrive, reading their body language, figuring out if you're into them, and thinking about all these social signals.
Like if they're already with someone or if they even like what you're wearing.
Yes, and this whole network is weighing the pros and cons of like going for it. And in prairie voles, this network is super sensitive to hormones that are all about bonding and attachment.
So it's not just one part of the brain that's about monogamy, but this whole network that affects how we connect with others.
Exactly. And while biology is definitely part of it, it's way more complicated than that. Our culture, our experiences, our values, all of that mixes with our biology to create our own unique relationship style.
Which probably explains why you can have two people with basically the same brain chemistry, but totally different approaches to relationships.
Exactly. There's no one answer for why some people love monogamy and others want something else, like consensual non-monogamy, CNM.
Right. And speaking of CNM, one of the sources talks about how it's becoming more common and how that clashes with how society often sees it versus what it's actually like for people in those relationships.
Yeah, people have a lot of assumptions about CNM, but the research shows a much more complex and nuanced picture.
So what does CNM actually look like according to this research? We should probably define it a bit first since it's a pretty broad term.
You're right, CNM covers a lot of different relationship styles, like open relationships, polyamory, and more. But the main thing is that everyone involved knows about it and agrees to it. It's about being open and honest, communicating clearly, and setting boundaries that everyone's okay with.
So it's not just about having multiple partners, but doing it ethically and with everyone on board.
Exactly. And the research says that when it's done ethically and consensually, CNM relationships can be just as happy and fulfilling as monogamous ones.
That's interesting because people often think CNM is somehow less valid or fulfilling. Like it's just about avoiding commitment or having casual flings.
And this research challenges that idea. For a lot of people in CNM relationships, it's not about novelty or avoiding commitment at all. It's about a different way of experiencing love and connection that feels more true to who they are.
That actually reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with that study on the desire for CNM.
Yeah,
So like for a lot of people, it's not just a phase or rebelling against tradition. It's a core part of who they are.
absolutely. That study found that a lot of people had felt that desire for multiple meaningful connections from their very first relationships. It wasn't about wanting lots of partners or being afraid of commitment. It was about a real desire for different kinds of intimacy with more than one person.
It's like they're wired for a different kind of love. And trying to force themselves into the monogamy box just doesn't work.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes you question everything we think we know about what's normal in relationships.
It really makes you think, especially when you consider those prairie voles. Even though they seem biologically wired for monogamy, sometimes they stray. What does that mean for us humans with all our complex desires and cultural influences? It's not just about biology, is it? It's like we put all these rules and expectations on relationships without ever really stopping to think about where they came from.
And that's what I love about these deep dives. They help us see past all those expectations and really get to the heart of what we're talking about. Love commitment, building a strong relationship, however that looks for you.
Yeah, like that psychologist said earlier, honesty and respecting boundaries are so important.
Mm.
But this whole conversation is making me wonder about something. What about those of us who aren't sure where we fit in all this? Like, what if you're not all about monogamy, but you're not polyamorous either? It feels like things are getting more complicated, not less.
That's such an important point. It shows how limiting labels can be. For a lot of people, their relationship style isn't fixed. It might change over time or even depending on the relationship.
So maybe it's not about finding the right label, but figuring out what feels authentic and right for you in each relationship.
Exactly. It's about talking openly with your partner, being honest about your needs and wants, and respecting each other's boundaries. And don't forget, this is a process.
Mhm.
What feels right now might change later on.
That actually makes me feel better. Like you
Mhm.
don't have to have it all figured out right away. But it also makes me wonder, with all this talk about accepting different relationship styles, what about people who still want monogamy? Is there still a place for that?
Of course, monogamy isn't going anywhere. And
Hmm.
for many people, it's a wonderful and fulfilling choice. The difference is that when we accept and respect all kinds of relationships, choosing monogamy becomes a real choice you make, not just what you're supposed to do.
So it's about choosing it actively for the right reasons, not just because it's what everyone expects.
Exactly. And that kind of self-awareness, really understanding yourself and what you want, can only lead to better, more fulfilling relationships, however you choose to build them.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. We've covered so much, from questioning whether monogamy is even natural, to looking at centuries of cultural norms, exploring the human brain, and diving into the world of ethical non-monogamy. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. And if there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this, it's that there's no right answer when it comes to relationships. What matters is finding what works for you, communicating openly with your partner, and building relationships based on honesty, respect, and real connection.
Well said. We've definitely given everyone a lot to ponder today,
Hmm.
and I'm sure this conversation will keep going long after this deep dive. So tell us what resonated with you, what challenged your own ideas about love and relationships. What will you be thinking about after you finish listening?